Story 1. The Unfinished Painting. The name Emil Gregor carried a weight that few artists ever achieve. His paintings were celebrated as surreal masterpieces, capturing the elusive line between dreams and nightmares. Yet, despite his fame, Gregor's final work, a piece titled Dreams of the Abyss, overshadowed his entire legacy. Not for its brilliance, but for its mystery. A decade ago, Gregor vanished without a trace, leaving behind a masterpiece that was never finished. The painting became a subject of legend, its location unknown, its very existence steeped in rumor. Some claimed it was cursed. Others said it wasn't just a painting but something more, something alive. I had always dismissed these stories as the embellishments of overzealous fans. But when I stumbled across an old article about Gregor's abandoned studio, I felt a pull I couldn't ignore. The studio, hidden on the outskirts of the city, had long since fallen into disrepair. Yet, in the article's grainy photo, something stood out, a draped easel in the center of the room. Could it be the infamous painting? Driven by a mix of curiosity and skepticism, I found myself standing before the studio's crumbling facade. The air was heavy, the kind of silence that feels alive. The door gave way with a reluctant groan, revealing an interior frozen in time. Dust covered every surface, and the scent of mildew and turpentine hung thick in the air. Scattered canvases leaned haphazardly against the walls, their images faded and forgotten. But there, in the heart of the room, stood the easel. Its sheet covering was yellowed with age, edges frayed like a neglected relic. My pulse quickened as I approached, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. This was it, the infamous Dreams of the Abyss. My hand trembled as I pulled back the sheet. The painting beneath was mesmerizing. At first glance, it seemed like a stormy seascape. Waves churned violently, crashing against an unseen shore, while the sky above swirled with ominous, bleeding colors. Yet, the more I stared, the less it resembled water or sky. Faces began to emerge from the chaos, their expressions twisted in anguish. The longer I looked, the more faces I saw, hundreds of them, mouths agape in silent screams. And at the center of it all stood a figure, half-formed and shadowy, yet undeniably human. Its posture was unnatural, its edges blurred, as if it were trying to step out of the canvas. But its face, or the hint of one, felt disturbingly familiar. Then I saw it. My own reflection, faint but unmistakable, staring back at me from the painting's surface. I blinked, and it was gone. My chest tightened as I took a step back. The figure in the painting seemed to shift, growing more defined, its features sharper and more recognizable. It wasn't just familiar. It was me. I stumbled over something and nearly fell. Looking down, I saw a pile of papers scattered across the floor. Among them were Gregor's notes, written in a frantic, almost illegible scrawl. One line stood out, circled multiple times. Asterisk, the painting is not art. It is a mirror. But it reflects not the body, only the soul. Asterisk. A chill ran through me. The air in the studio seemed heavier, charged with something I couldn't name. And then I heard it, a whisper, faint and indistinct, like wind through a cracked window. Asterisk, finish me. Asterisk. The words were soft but insistent, growing louder with each repetition. I wanted to leave, to run, but my feet wouldn't move. My gaze was locked on the painting, And before I realized it, my hand had reached out to a nearby brush. I didn't want to pick it up, but something compelled me, as if the painting itself demanded it. The moment the brush touched the canvas, everything changed. The room darkened. The whispers turned into a deafening roar, and my vision blurred. The painting seemed to come alive under my hand. Shapes formed with impossible speed. Colors bled together unnaturally. And the figure at the center grew clearer and clearer. Time lost all meaning. I painted through what felt like hours. Days, maybe longer. My body ached. My mind screamed for rest. But I couldn't stop. The painting demanded completion. Finally, the noise ceased. The studio was silent once more. I stepped back, trembling, and looked at what I had created. The painting was complete. The figure at its center now stood fully formed. And its face was mine. Yet, the eyes staring back at me were not. They were hollow, dark, and filled with something ancient and hungry. Panic surged through me. I dropped the brush and fled the studio, stumbling into the night. But as I reached the safety of my apartment, I realized the nightmare wasn't over. Every reflective surface, mirrors, windows, even the screen of my phone, now showed not my face, but the face from the painting. Its eyes followed me wherever I went. Watching. Waiting. The whispers returned. Faint at first but growing louder with each passing day. Asterisk, finish me. Asterisk. I've abandoned everything, my job, my friends, my life. I live in isolation, avoiding anything that might show me my reflection. But I know it's only a matter of time. The painting still calls to me, its pull growing stronger. If you ever hear of Emil Gregor's Dreams of the Abyss, stay away. Do not seek the painting. And for the love of God, do not pick up the brush. Some creations are never meant to be finished. Story 2. Room 13. The Langridge Hotel was an old relic of the city. Built in the 1920s during the golden age of grand architecture. Its faded elegance hinted at a history full of secrets, scandals, and untold stories. Yet for all its charm, it was the subject of persistent rumors, whispers about Room 13. I'd always loved a good mystery. As a travel journalist, I'd encountered my fair share of ghost stories. But Room 13 intrigued me like no other. According to hotel staff, it didn't exist. The rooms on the 13th floor skipped from 12 to 14. As if 13 had been erased from history. Guests and employees alike avoided discussing it. And any mention of the room was met with nervous laughter or a hurried change of subject. That's why I decided to stay there. I booked a week-long stay at Langridge, requesting a room on the 13th floor. The receptionist hesitated, her smile faltering as she processed my request. "We don't have a room 13, she said. Her tone clipped. "Of course," I replied, playing along. "Just give me the closest thing to it." She handed me the key to room 1421, 14th floor. Corner unit. But I had a plan. On my second night, after exploring the city during the day, I returned to the hotel and waited until the halls were silent. Around midnight, I grabbed my camera and notebook, then headed for the elevator. When I reached the 13th floor, I stepped out. The hallway stretched before me, dimly lit and eerily quiet. Just as I had read online. There was no room 13. The numbers skipped from 1212 to 1214. But as I walked down the corridor, a strange sensation prickled at the back of my neck. That's when I saw it. There was no plaque. No markings. Just a door. Faint outlines of a number. Long scratched away. Remained on the surface, evidence that something had been there. My heart pounded as I approached. The air around the door heavy. Oppressive. I tested the knob. It turned. The room was pitch dark. Its interior shrouded in shadows. I clicked on my flashlight. And the beam swept over what looked like a standard hotel room: bed, dresser, nightstand. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, as if it hadn't been touched in decades. And then I noticed the mirror. It hung on the far wall, cracked but intact. The moment my light fell on it, I felt a chill run down my spine. My reflection was there, but something was off. The figure in the mirror wasn't mimicking my movements. It stood still, its head tilted ever so slightly, watching me with eyes that felt too sharp, too aware. The door slammed shut behind me. Panic surged through my veins as I spun around. But the room was empty. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows that danced along the walls. Then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound, like someone breathing heavily. It was coming from the mirror. I forced myself to look back at it. My reflection was gone. In its place was the outline of another figure. Taller, with elongated limbs and an unnatural posture. Its face was obscured, but its hands pressed against the glass as if trying to push through. I stumbled back, tripping over the edge of the bed. The breathing grew louder, accompanied by a low whisper that I couldn't understand. The mirror began to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone, and the figure leaned closer, its form shifting unnaturally. Desperation overtook me. I scrambled to the door, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew into a chorus, incomprehensible and deafening. As the air in the room grew colder, my flashlight went out completely, plunging me into darkness. And then, silence. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed by fear. When I finally gathered the courage to turn around, the room was empty again. The mirror was cracked, the figure gone. The door creaked open on its own, and I bolted out, not stopping until I was safely back in my room. The next morning, I packed my bags and left the hotel. As I checked out, the receptionist avoided meeting my gaze. I asked her about room 13 again, but she simply shook her head. "That room hasn't existed for years," she said softly. "Not since the incident." She wouldn't elaborate. To this day, I can't explain what happened in that room. I've reviewed the footage from my camera countless times, but all I see is static. Yet every now and then, when I catch my reflection in a mirror, I swear I see something else. A figure in the background, watching, waiting. If you ever find yourself at the Langridge Hotel, heed my advice: don't go looking for room 13. Some doors are meant to stay closed. Story 3. The radio. It started with a yard sale on a rainy Sunday afternoon. Among the rusted tools, old books, and faded furniture, I found it, a battered, vintage radio. Its edges were chipped, its knobs worn smooth, and the dial was frozen somewhere between two frequencies. It didn't look like much, but something about it felt intriguing. The old man selling it gave me a strange look when I asked about it. "That radio's trouble," he muttered. shaking his head. But I brushed him off, handed him a $5 bill, and took it home. That night, I decided to test it, plugging it in. I was surprised when the small device crackled to life. Static filled the room, loud and grating. But as I adjusted the knob, it settled on a faint, tinny voice. A severe thunderstorm warning has been issued for the area. Expect heavy rain and possible flooding. I smiled. A weather report, nothing spooky about that. I set the radio on the kitchen counter and didn't think much of it. But the next morning, I woke to clear skies. No rain. No flooding. It wasn't until I turned on the TV that I realized the report hadn't been for that day, it was for the evening ahead. The exact storm the radio described hit my neighborhood. Right on schedule. I shrugged it off as coincidence. But the radio's next prediction made me pause. 2 days later, it announced the results of a horse race hours before they were broadcast. I didn't even follow horse racing. But out of curiosity, I checked. Every name, every result, exactly as the radio had said. Curiosity turned into obsession. Each evening, the radio buzzed and hummed, delivering strange and specific broadcasts, election results before polls had even closed. The name of a missing child found alive hours later. The winner of a lottery I'd never heard of. It was always accurate. But the broadcasts began to change. They grew darker. One night, the radio announced a factory fire, 43 dead, dozens injured. The next morning, it was on every news channel. Another night, it predicted a car accident on the highway near my house. I tried to warn the police, but they dismissed me as a crank. The accident happened anyway. And then it got personal. One night, as the static cleared, the radio spoke a single, chilling sentence. A local man, John Carver, will be found dead in his home tomorrow morning. My heart froze. That was my name. I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the unease. It had to be a mistake. A glitch. But the voice repeated it, calm and certain, over and over. A local man, John Carver, will be found dead in his home tomorrow morning. I unplugged the radio and threw it into the closet. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the wind outside sent my heart racing. But morning came, and I was still alive. Relief washed over me as I stepped outside to grab the paper. That's when I saw the headline. Local man found dead in apparent suicide. The name wasn't mine. It was another John Carver, a man who lived 2 towns over. I felt sick. The radio wasn't wrong. It had never been wrong. I should have left it alone. I should have destroyed it. But I didn't. I needed answers. That night, I plugged it back in. The static returned. Louder this time. More insistent. And then the voice spoke again. John Carver will die in his home tomorrow. My stomach turned. It wasn't vague this time. It was me. I tried to leave, but my car wouldn't start. I called friends, but no one answered. Even the police didn't take me seriously when I called them, begging for help. It felt like the radio had trapped me, keeping me tethered to my house, to my fate. I stayed up all night, pacing, gripping a kitchen knife like it would save me. The hours dragged by, every shadow feeling like it was closing in. And then, just before dawn, the static began to hum again. I turned to the radio. It was unplugged. But its voice came through loud and clear. John Carver will die in his home. Now. The knife slipped from my hand as the lights flickered and went out. In the darkness, I heard the static grow louder, drowning out my panicked breaths. And then, silence. I woke up in the hospital, surrounded by doctors and police. They told me my neighbor had found me unconscious in my kitchen. No one could explain how or why I'd collapsed. And no one believed me when I tried to explain about the radio. When I returned home, it was gone. The closet was empty, and every trace of it had vanished. But sometimes, late at night, I hear a faint hum of static coming from somewhere deep in the house. And I know it's still out there, waiting. If you ever find a vintage radio at a yard sale, don't buy it. Don't even look at it. Some voices aren't meant to be heard. Story 4. The Ghost Line. Urban legends often revolve around places people have long abandoned. Forgotten buildings, empty highways, or, in this case, an unused subway line. In our city, it's called the Ghost Line. A stretch of track that once connected downtown to the suburbs but was sealed off decades ago. Officially, it was deemed unsafe due to structural instability. But unofficially, stories circulated about passengers who never came back. Strange figures seen through train windows. And a deep, unsettling hum that could still be heard in the tunnels at night. Of course, that didn't stop us. It was my friend Eric's idea. He'd heard about an old service entrance near the South Station and wanted to explore the Ghost Line for a vlog. Think about the views, he said, grinning. People eat this stuff up. I wasn't so sure. I'd heard enough rumors to know the place wasn't just spooky, it was dangerous. But Eric was relentless. And so, one Friday night, I found myself standing in the cold outside a rusted gate, flashlight in hand. The entrance was exactly as Eric had described, hidden behind a row of shrubs. Barely noticeable. The gate creaked open with an ear-piercing wail, revealing a narrow stairwell that descended into darkness. The air grew colder with every step, and by the time we reached the bottom, my breath was visible in the dim light. The tunnel stretched endlessly before us. The walls lined with peeling tiles and graffiti. A single set of tracks ran along the floor, rusted and broken in places. It smelled of mildew and rot. And the only sound was the drip of water echoing off the walls. We followed the tracks for what felt like an eternity. Eric's camera light bobbed ahead of me, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. "Look at this place," he whispered, panning the camera around. "Creepy as hell." "Yeah," I muttered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. That's when we heard it, a low, distant rumble. At first, I thought it was thunder. But it grew louder. Rhythmic. Like the sound of an approaching train. I turned to Eric. But he just grinned. "Probably some old machinery," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. The sound grew closer. The tracks began to vibrate beneath our feet. And then, out of the darkness, a light appeared, dim and flickering, like a dying bulb. "There's no way," I stammered, stepping back. Eric grabbed my arm. "Come on. This is what we came for." Before I could protest, the light intensified, and a train emerged from the shadows. It was ancient. Its exterior corroded and covered in grime. The windows were dark, but I could feel something watching us from inside. The train screeched to a halt a few feet away. The doors sliding open with a hiss. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then Eric, ever the daredevil, stepped forward. "We have to check it out," he said, his voice trembling with excitement. "No," I said firmly. "This is a bad idea." But he ignored me, climbing aboard before I could stop him. Reluctantly, I followed. The interior was as decrepit as the outside, broken seats, shattered windows, and a thick layer of dust coating everything. The air was stale, tinged with a metallic scent that made my stomach churn. "Look at this," Eric whispered, pointing his camera at a seat. A name was carved into the leather. Jagged and uneven, "Help me." Before I could respond, the train lurched forward, throwing us off balance. The doors slammed shut, and the lights inside flickered to life. "What the hell?" I shouted, gripping a pole for support. Eric's face paled. "I didn't touch anything." The train picked up speed, the sound of its wheels screeching against the tracks filling the cabin. I ran to the door and pounded on the glass, but it wouldn't budge. Outside, the tunnel blurred into darkness, the occasional flash of graffiti the only indication we were still moving. And then, the lights went out. The cabin plunged into blackness. I could hear Eric's panicked breathing somewhere behind me. "Stay close," I shouted. But my voice was swallowed by the hum, low and resonant, growing louder with every second. The lights flickered back on, and that's when I saw them. Figures filled the cabin, their faces pale and lifeless. They wore outdated clothes, some torn and stained, others disintegrating into rags. Their eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to suck the light from the room. They didn't move, but their heads were all turned toward us. Eric screamed. I grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the door, desperately trying to force it open. The figures remained still, but their eyes followed our every movement. The train screeched to a halt, throwing us to the floor. The doors slid open, revealing nothing but a black void beyond. A voice crackled over the intercom, distorted and inhuman. "End of the line." Eric bolted, leaping through the open door into the darkness. I hesitated, glancing back at the figures. They were moving now, their heads jerking unnaturally as they began to approach. Without thinking, I followed Eric, plunging into the void. When I woke, I was lying on the platform at the South Station, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon. Eric was nowhere to be found. I've returned to the ghost line many times, searching for answers. But the entrance we used that night is gone, sealed behind layers of concrete. No one believes me when I tell them what happened. And Eric has never been seen again. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the sound of a train in the distance, a low, mournful whistle echoing through the city. And I wonder, is he still riding that cursed line, trapped between stations, waiting for someone to take his place? Story 5. The Writing on the Mirror. I moved into the old house on Willow Lane in the dead of winter. It wasn't my first choice, but the rent was cheap. And after my recent breakup, I needed a fresh start. The house itself wasn't much, a creaky two-story with drafty windows and pipes that groaned at night. But it had potential. I told myself, all it needed was some love. The first night passed uneventfully. I unpacked, made some tea, and curled up with a book. But the next morning, something strange happened. In the bathroom mirror, scrawled across the fogged glass, were the words, asterisk, who are you? Asterisk. I froze. The handwriting was jagged, uneven, like it had been scratched into the condensation with a shaky hand. I wiped it away with a towel, blaming it on leftover moisture or my imagination. Maybe the previous tenant had written it, and it somehow reappeared. That was a thing, right? But the writing didn't stop. The next morning, the mirror fogged up as usual while I showered. When I stepped out, I found another message waiting for me, asterisk, why are you here? Asterisk. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold bathroom tiles. My reflection in the mirror looked just as confused as I felt. I wiped the glass clean again, trying to shake off the creeping unease. It had to be some kind of prank. Maybe the landlord was messing with me. Or maybe the house had weird plumbing quirks that left patterns on the glass. But the messages became more frequent and more direct. By the third morning, it wasn't just a question, it was a demand, asterisk, get out. Asterisk. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The handwriting wasn't mine. And it wasn't random. Someone, or something, was trying to communicate with me. One night, after another long day at work, I decided to test it. I stood in the bathroom, turned on the hot water, and watched as the steam fogged up the mirror. At first, there was nothing. Just my own tired reflection staring back at me. But then, slowly, words began to appear, as if an invisible finger was tracing them from the other side. Asterisk, you're not safe. Asterisk. My breath hitched. I felt the walls of the tiny bathroom closing in, the air growing colder despite the steaming water. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called my landlord to ask about the house's history. She was evasive, brushing off my questions with vague assurances that nothing bad had ever happened there. But her tone betrayed her nervousness, and I knew she was lying. Desperate for answers, I began searching online for any mention of the house. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. A decade ago, a man named David Larkin had lived there. He was a recluse, rarely seen by neighbors, until the day he was found dead in the bathroom. The official cause was suicide, slashed wrists in the tub, but the details were vague, and the case quickly faded from public attention. That night, I stood in front of the mirror again. My hands were shaking, but I needed to know. I turned on the hot water and waited. The message appeared almost immediately. Asterisk, help me. Asterisk. I leaned in closer, my breath fogging the edges of the glass. Who are you? I whispered, my voice trembling. The words vanished, the steam swirling into chaotic patterns. And then, new writing appeared. Asterisk, he's still here. Asterisk. A cold dread washed over me. I backed out of the bathroom, slamming the door shut. The sound echoed through the empty house, but it did little to drown out the pounding of my heart. I didn't understand. Who was he? And why did this presence seem so desperate to warn me? That night, I dreamed of the mirror. In my dream, my reflection didn't move when I did. It stared at me, unblinking, a sinister smile creeping across its face. And then, it stepped forward, out of the glass. I woke in a cold sweat, the house unnervingly silent. But something felt wrong. The air was heavy, oppressive, and the shadows seemed to shift in the corners of the room, summoning every ounce of courage. I crept to the bathroom. The mirror was fogged. Even though I hadn't used the shower, words covered its surface, overlapping and frantic, as if scrawled by a dozen hands at once. Asterisk, get out. Get out. Get out. Asterisk. And then, beneath the writing, a shape began to emerge. It wasn't a reflection, it was something else. Something alive, pressing against the other side of the glass. Its face was twisted, its eyes hollow and dark. It raised a hand, pressing it against the mirror. I felt the temperature drop as frost crept along the edges of the glass. That was the last straw. I grabbed my keys and ran, leaving the house and everything inside it behind. I never went back. When I contacted the landlord to break my lease, she didn't seem surprised. "You're not the first," she said quietly. "And you won't be the last. The house still stands. But I've heard rumors that no tenant stays longer than a month. Some say the mirror was removed, but others claim it's still there, waiting for someone else to look too closely. If you ever move into an old house and the mirrors start talking to you, do yourself a favor, listen. Some reflections aren't yours to see." Story 6. The Forgotten Road. It was supposed to be a shortcut. That's what the old man at the gas station said, leaning against the counter with a knowing smirk. "It'll save you at least an hour," he promised. "Just take Old Creek Road past the woods. Hardly anyone uses it anymore. But it'll get you there." I should have known better. There was something off about the way he said it, the glint in his eyes as he watched me walk out the door. But I was already running late, and the thought of saving an hour was too tempting to ignore. The sun was setting as I found the turnoff. Old Creek Road was barely more than a single lane, flanked by dense trees that seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions. The pavement was cracked and uneven, weeds pushing through the fissures like stubborn reminders of nature reclaiming its own. As I drove deeper into the woods, the air grew heavier, the sky darkening faster than it should have. The road twisted and turned, each bend obscured by the overhanging canopy. My headlights struggled to cut through the growing gloom, illuminating only the narrow stretch of asphalt ahead. It was quiet. Too quiet. No birds. No rustling leaves. Just the hum of my engine and the crunch of gravel beneath my tires. I turned on the radio to break the silence, but all I got was static. My phone had no signal either. That's when I saw the first sign. It was old and weathered. Its paint faded to near illegibility, but I could just make out the words, "No exit beyond this point." I slowed down, my gut telling me to turn back. But the road was too narrow to make a U-turn, and reversing through the winding path felt even more dangerous. "It's just an old sign," I told myself. "Probably left over from when the road was first closed." I kept driving. The second sign came about a mile later. This one was clearer, freshly painted as if someone had put it there recently. "Turn around now." My heart pounded. The trees seemed closer now, their twisted branches reaching toward the car like skeletal fingers. I pressed down on the gas, eager to leave this place behind. But no matter how far I drove, the road stretched on endlessly. I passed no other cars, no intersections, no landmarks. Just mile after mile of the same oppressive forest, the same cracked pavement. It was like the road was looping, repeating itself in some cruel, impossible way. And then I saw the figure. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer. Maybe. Or a stray dog. But as I got closer, I realized it was a person. A man. Standing in the middle of the road. His back was to me. His silhouette illuminated by my high beams. He didn't move as I approached. Didn't even flinch. I slowed to a crawl. My hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. "Hey!" I called out through the open window. "Do you need help?" No response. I honked the horn. But the man didn't react. His clothes were tattered. His frame unnaturally thin. And then he turned around. I wish he hadn't. His face, or what was left of it, was hollow. As if the flesh had been peeled away. Leaving only a mask of raw, exposed muscle. His eyes were black pits. Empty voids that seemed to swallow the light. He raised a hand. Bony fingers pointing past me. Back the way I'd come. I slammed on the gas. Swerving around him and speeding down the road. My heart was in my throat. My breaths coming in shallow gasps. But no matter how far I drove, I couldn't escape. The road just kept going. Twisting and turning. Leading me deeper into the woods. And then I saw the car. It was parked on the side of the road. Its hood crumpled like it had hit something. The doors were open. The interior empty. As I passed, I realized it was my car, or at least an identical version of it. Same make. Same model. Even the same scratch on the rear bumper. I hit the brakes. My mind racing. Was this some kind of sick joke? Had I somehow circled back without realizing it? But the car was covered in moss and rust. Like it had been sitting there for years. I didn't have time to think. A low hum filled the air. Growing louder by the second. It wasn't the sound of an engine or any animal I'd ever heard. It was something unnatural. Vibrating through the air. Shaking the car. And then the shadows came. They emerged from the trees. Dozens of them. Their forms indistinct but humanoid. They moved unnaturally. Jerking and twitching as they approached. I threw the car into reverse. My tires screeching as I tried to escape. But the road had other plans. The asphalt cracked and buckled beneath me. The trees closing in like a living wall. The shadows surrounded the car. Their faces, or lack thereof, pressing against the windows. Their hollow eyes stared through me. Their mouths opening in silent screams. And then everything went black. I woke up in my car. Parked at the edge of Old Creek Road. The sun was rising. The forest bathed in golden light. There was no sign of the cracked pavement. No signs warning me to turn back. Just an empty road stretching into the distance. But I know what I saw. And I know I'll never take a shortcut again. If you ever find yourself on Old Creek Road, don't listen to the directions. Don't trust the signs. And whatever you do, don't stop. Some roads aren't meant to be traveled.